When the Galactic Empire's massive dreadnought emerged from hyperspace above Earth, its hull gleaming with the arrogance of 1,000 conquered worlds, Admiral Kethvar expected the usual response from primitive species: terror, desperate pleas for mercy, or perhaps pathetic attempts at negotiation. What he didn't expect was for humanity's response to come in the form of weapons fire that turned his flagship's shields into brilliant fireworks against the void of space. The Empire had subjugated over 1,200 species across 47 star systems. None had ever dared to shoot first. But, then, again, none of them had been human. This is the story of how Earth's surrender became the Empire's greatest mistake, and how humanity's definition of compliance would rewrite the very foundations of galactic civilization. Sometimes the prey has teeth sharper than the predator ever imagined. The bridge of the Imperial Dreadnought Sovereign's wrath hummed with the quiet confidence of absolute power. Admiral Kethvar, his forearms crossed behind his back in a gesture that had intimidated countless species across the galaxy, watched the blue-green planet rotate slowly on the main display. Earth. Such an unremarkable name for what would soon become just another number in the Empire's vast catalogue of subjugated worlds. Status report, Kethvar commanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had never known defeat. Sub-Commander Ilex, her elongated head bobbing with nervous energy, consulted her holographic display. Long-range scans confirmed the presence of a primitive civilization, Admiral. Technology level appears to be early spaceflight capability. They have basic satellites and what appears to be a space station in low orbit. Weapons capabilities? Minimal, sir. Chemical propulsion rockets, basic nuclear technology. Their most advanced military vessels appear to be confined to their oceans. Ilex paused, her three eyes blinking in sequence. In short, Admiral, they pose no threat to the Empire. Kethvar nodded, satisfied. It was always the same story. The Empire's scouts had identified Earth as resource-rich but defended by nothing more threatening than a species that had barely learned to leave their own atmosphere. Another routine conquest to add to his already impressive record. Deploy the standard intimidation formation, he ordered. 3 heavy cruisers in flanking positions, destroyers forming the outer perimeter. I want every human on that planet to look up at their sky and know that their lives now belong to the Empire. The massive fleet moved with practiced precision, each vessel a testament to the Empire's technological supremacy. The Sovereign's wrath alone was over 2 kilometers long, bristling with plasma cannons and particle beam arrays capable of reducing entire cities to ash in minutes. Behind it, 37 other vessels formed an overwhelming display of force that had broken the will of every species that had ever witnessed it. Communications array ready, Admiral, reported the tactical officer. Shall I begin the standard surrender protocol? Kethvar allowed himself a small smile. The surrender protocol was his favorite part of any conquest. A few carefully chosen words about the futility of resistance, a demonstration of their weapons against some uninhabited target, and the planet's leaders would fall over themselves to negotiate terms. It was almost disappointingly easy. Open a channel to their planet. All frequencies. The main display shifted to show Kethvar's imposing figure, his ceremonial armor gleaming under the bridge lights. Behind him, the bridge of the Sovereign's wrath stretched into the distance, a careful display of both power and sophistication designed to overwhelm primitive minds. People of Earth, he began, his voice amplified and broadcast across every communication device on the planet below. I am Admiral Kethvar of the Galactic Empire. Your planet has been selected for incorporation into our domain. You will surrender immediately and unconditionally. He paused, allowing the words to sink in across the billions of minds now listening to their first contact with an alien civilization. Resistance is futile. Your primitive technology cannot stand against the might of the Empire. You have 30 of your Earth minutes to respond with your complete surrender, or we will demonstrate the consequences of defiance. The communication channel closed, and Kethvar settled back into his command chair. 30 minutes was generous, really. Most species managed to grovel for mercy within 10. Admiral, the communications officer called out, we're receiving a response. Already? That was quick, even for primitives. Put it through. The main display flickered and, then, showed what appeared to be a human military command center. The figure at the center of the screen was a woman with graying hair and sharp eyes that held no trace of the fear Kethvar had expected to see. She wore what appeared to be a military uniform, though primitive by Imperial standards. "This is Admiral Sarah Chen of the United Earth Defense Force," she said, her voice steady and controlled. "Your message has been received and reviewed." Kethvar leaned forward. The human's composure was unusual but not unprecedented. Some species attempted to maintain dignity even in the face of overwhelming odds. "We reject your demand for surrender," Admiral Chen continued, and Kethvar blinked in surprise. "Earth is not interested in joining your empire. We suggest you leave our solar system immediately." A stunned silence fell over the bridge of the Sovereign's wrath. In over 2 centuries of conquest, no primitive species had ever simply rejected the Empire's demands. There were always negotiations, pleas for better terms, attempts to bargain. Never outright refusal. Furthermore, Admiral Chen added, her expression hardening, any hostile action against Earth or its people will be met with appropriate force. You have been warned. The communication channel closed from the human side, leaving Kethvar staring at a blank screen. Around him, his bridge crew exchanged nervous glances. The silence stretched for several long moments before the Admiral found his voice. Did she just threaten us?" he asked, more bewildered than angry. "It appears so, sir," Subcommander Ilex replied uncertainly. Kethvar stood slowly, his forearms beginning to gesture in agitation. "They threatened us. A primitive, barely spacefaring species just threatened the Galactic Empire." His voice began to rise. "They have chemical rockets and we have plasma cannons that can crack continents, and they threatened us." The bridge erupted in nervous murmurs. Several junior officers began consulting their tactical displays as if searching for some hidden threat they had missed in their initial scans. "Sir," the tactical officer ventured, "our scans were thorough. There's no indication of any advanced defensive capabilities. Their largest military vessels appear to be primitive submarines and surface ships. No orbital defenses beyond that single space station." "Then, they're either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid," Kethvar muttered. "Subcommander, bring us to battle readiness. If they want a demonstration of Imperial power, they'll get one." "Sir, what target should we designate for the demonstration?" Ilex asked. Kethvar studied the planet below, his anger building. No species had ever forced him to actually carry out a demonstration. The threat was usually enough. That space station of theirs. Reduce it to atoms. Let them watch their pathetic achievement in space become dust. Target acquired, Admiral. All batteries ready. Fire. The Sovereign's wrath unleashed a concentrated barrage of plasma bolts toward the human space station. The brilliant energy beams lanced through space, more than enough firepower to vaporize the small structure instantly. Kethvar watched with satisfaction as the bolts closed the distance to their target. What happened next would be discussed in Imperial tactical academies for generations to come. The space around the human station suddenly shimmered, and a translucent blue barrier materialized directly in the path of the incoming plasma bolts. The Imperial weapons struck the barrier and simply vanished, absorbed completely without even a flash of impact energy. "What in the void was that?" Kethvar demanded. "Unknown, sir. Some form of defensive shield, but the technology is..." The tactical officer paused, rechecking his readings. "Sir, the energy signature doesn't match anything in our databases." Before anyone could respond, proximity alarms began shrieking throughout the bridge. The main display automatically shifted to tactical view, and what Kethvar saw made his blood freeze in his veins. Ships were emerging from what appeared to be empty space around Earth. Not the primitive chemical-powered vessels their scans had detected, but sleek, predatory-looking craft that seemed to materialize out of nothing. Dozens of them, then hundreds, all moving with a purposeful grace that spoke of advanced technology and clear intent. "How many?" Kethvar whispered. "Still counting, sir. Current contacts number over 400 and climbing. They're using some form of cloaking technology we can't penetrate." "Admiral," the communications officer called out, his voice tight with stress, "incoming transmission from the planet."
Put it through, Kethvar said, though his earlier confidence had evaporated completely.
Admiral Chen appeared on the screen again, but this time she was not alone. Behind her, Kethvar could see what appeared to be a massive military command center bustling with activity. Humans moved purposefully between stations that displayed technology that looked nothing like the primitive equipment their scans had detected.
Admiral Kethvar, Chen said, and Kethvar noticed she was no longer using his imperial title.
You fired on a civilian station.
That was a mistake.
That is, your scan showed primitive technology, Kethvar stammered, his usual composure cracking. Our scan showed exactly what we wanted them to show, Chen replied calmly.
Humanity learned long ago that the universe can be a dangerous place. We've been preparing for first contact for over a century.
We just didn't expect that contact to begin with a demand for surrender. On the tactical display, the human ships had formed a perfect sphere around the Imperial fleet. Each vessel was significantly smaller than the Imperial cruisers, but something about their positioning and movement patterns suggested they were far from helpless.
You have a choice, Admiral, Chen continued.
You can leave our system peacefully, or you can discover why humanity has survived as long as it has despite being, as you put it, a primitive species. Kethvar looked around his bridge, seeing his own confusion reflected in the faces of his crew.
This wasn't how first contact was supposed to go.
Primitive species were supposed to be terrified, grateful, eager to submit to imperial rule. They weren't supposed to have fleets of advanced warships hidden behind cloaking technology.
Admiral, his tactical officer called out urgently, the human vessels are powering weapons.
Energy signatures are, sir, they're unlike anything we've seen before.
This is impossible, Kethvar muttered.
Our intelligence reports, our long-range scans, everything indicated a primitive civilization.
Maybe that's what they wanted you to think, Sub-Commander Ilix suggested quietly.
On the screen, Admiral Chen seemed to hear his words despite the closed channel.
Intelligence is only as good as the information you're allowed to gather, Admiral. Humanity has been watching your empire's expansion for quite some time.
We know about your conquest protocols, your intimidation tactics, your standard operating procedures.
She leaned forward slightly.
What you don't know is that we've been specifically preparing for your arrival for the past 50 years.
Kethvar felt a chill run through him. 50 years?
That was before the Empire had even identified Earth as a potential target.
How could they have known?
The choice is yours, Admiral, Chen said, her voice taking on a harder edge.
Leave now, and this encounter can end peacefully.
Continue your aggression, and you'll discover why every species that has ever threatened humanity's home has come to regret that decision. The bridge of the Sovereign's wrath was silent except for the soft humming of the ship's systems and the occasional beep of monitoring equipment.
Kethvar stared at the display showing the human fleet surrounding his forces.
400 ships to his 38, all using technology that shouldn't exist according to every piece of intelligence the Empire possessed.
Sir, the tactical officer said quietly, recommend we withdraw and report back to Imperial Command. This situation requires further analysis. Kethvar's pride warred with his tactical sense.
Retreat from a primitive species would be a stain on his record that might never be removed. But the alternative might be the destruction of his entire fleet by an enemy they clearly knew nothing about. Admiral Chen, he said finally, opening the communication channel, the Galactic Empire does not retreat from primitive worlds.
Then, perhaps, Chen replied, it's time you learned that humanity is far from primitive.
The last thing Kethvar saw before the shooting started was Admiral Chen's smile. It wasn't the smile of someone facing impossible odds. It was the smile of someone who had been waiting a very long time for this exact moment. The first salvo from the human fleet came without warning. One moment, Admiral Kethvar was staring at Admiral Chen's confident smile on his main display, and, the next, his entire worldview was being rewritten by weapons that defied every law of physics he thought he understood. The human ships didn't fire plasma bolts or particle beams like civilized species. Instead, they unleashed something that looked like concentrated starlight itself. The beams struck the Sovereign's Wrath's shields and didn't dissipate. They didn't bounce off or get absorbed. They simply passed through the energy barriers as if they didn't exist and began carving precise lines across the dreadnought's armor plating. Lines that glowed white-hot and began spreading like cracks in ice. "Shields are ineffective," the tactical officer shouted over the sudden chaos of alarms and shouted orders.
"Whatever they're using, it's bypassing our defensive systems completely."
Kethvar gripped his command chair as the ship shuddered under impacts that felt different from any weapons fire he'd ever experienced.
"Return fire. All batteries."
The Imperial fleet's response was immediate and overwhelming. Dozens of plasma cannons and particle beam arrays lit up the space between the two fleets with enough destructive energy to level mountain ranges. The coordinated barrage from 38 warships should have been enough to overwhelm any defense, primitive or otherwise.
The human ships simply weren't there anymore.
Where did they go?
Kethvar demanded, watching the tactical display in disbelief as their targeting systems lost lock on every single enemy vessel.
"Unknown, sir. They've vanished from all sensors. No energy signatures, no mass readings, nothing." The answer came in the form of weapons fire from impossible angles.
The human ships reappeared inside the Imperial formation, having somehow teleported past every defensive perimeter.
They were moving in patterns that violated basic physics, making sharp 90-degree turns at speeds that should have reduced their crews to paste against the bulkheads.
"Evasive maneuvers,"
Kethvar shouted, but his order was already too late. The Imperial cruiser domination's edge simply came apart. Not from a massive explosion or catastrophic hull breach, but from what appeared to be controlled molecular dissolution. The 2-kilometer-long warship began separating into its component atoms, starting from the engine section and moving forward like an unstoppable wave of destruction.
The crew's final transmission was a single, terrified scream that cut off as the wave reached the bridge.
"What kind of weapons are those?" Subcommander Ilix whispered, her three eyes fixed on the display where a proud Imperial cruiser had been reduced to its base elements in less than 30 seconds. "Sir, incoming transmission from Admiral Chen," the communications officer reported, his voice shaking. "Put it through," Kethvar said, though he was no longer sure he wanted to hear what the human had to say. Admiral Chen appeared on the screen, but now she was standing in what appeared to be the command center of one of the human vessels. Behind her, Kethvar could see displays showing perfect tactical information about every ship in his fleet, including detailed schematics and crew complements. "Admiral Kethvar," she said, and her tone was almost sympathetic, "you're fighting a battle you cannot win with weapons you don't understand against an enemy you've seriously underestimated.
This is your final opportunity to withdraw." "How?" Kethvar asked, abandoning all pretense of Imperial dignity.
"How is any of this possible? Your species achieved spaceflight less than a century ago."
Chen nodded slowly.
"That's true. But you're making the same mistake that every aggressive species makes when they encounter humanity.
You're assuming that technological advancement follows a linear path." On the tactical display, another Imperial ship began to disintegrate. The destroyer Swift Retribution was caught in some kind of field that seemed to accelerate time around it. Kethvar watched in horror as the ship aged decades in seconds, its hull corroding and its systems failing as entropy itself became a weapon.
"Humanity didn't develop faster than light travel by improving our engines," Chen continued, her voice calm despite the destruction happening around them.
"We developed it by learning to fold space itself. We didn't build better shields by increasing power output. We learned to shift our ships slightly out of phase with normal reality."
A human vessel materialized directly above the Imperial heavy cruiser Righteous Fury and did something that made Kethvar's scientific understanding of the universe crumble completely. The smaller human ship somehow increased its gravitational mass to that of a small moon and simply fell onto the cruiser, crushing the larger vessel like an insect while remaining completely undamaged itself. "Our weapons don't fire energy at you," Chen explained, as if she were giving a lecture to students rather than destroying his fleet.
"They fire entropy, probability cascades, quantum uncertainty fields. We learned long ago that the universe itself can be convinced to become your ally if you ask it the right way." "This is impossible," Kethvar muttered, watching his formation collapse around him.
"The Empire has conquered over 1,200 worlds. We know what primitive species are capable of." "You know what primitive species have been willing to show you," Chen corrected.
"Admiral, how many of those 1,200 conquests began with the defending species shooting first?"
Kethvar paused, his tactical training finally overriding his shock.
The answer was 0. Every single conquest had followed the same pattern: arrival, intimidation, surrender, integration. No species had ever opened fire on Imperial forces during first contact. You see, Chen continued, most intelligent species, when faced with overwhelming odds, choose survival over pride. They submit, they adapt, they find ways to preserve their culture within Imperial rule. It's logical, rational behavior. Another Imperial ship vanished, this one simply ceasing to exist as if it had never been built. No explosion, no debris field, just an empty patch of space where a destroyer had been moments before. But humanity has never been particularly logical about survival, Chen said, and Kethvar could hear something in her voice that made his skin crawl. It was the tone of someone explaining a fundamental truth about the universe that everyone else had been too polite to mention. We're persistence predators, Admiral. It's how we evolved. When we decide that something needs to be destroyed, we don't stop. We don't negotiate. We don't accept terms. We simply continue applying force until the problem ceases to exist. The tactical officer looked up from his console, his face pale. Admiral, we've lost 14 ships. The humans are adapting to our tactics in real time. Every weapon we fire, every maneuver we attempt, they counter it before we've even completed the action. How is that possible? Kethvar demanded. Chen smiled again, and this time Kethvar understood why that expression had seemed so unsettling before. Because we've been studying your tactics for 50 years, Admiral. Every conquest, every battle, every strategic decision your empire has made, we've recorded and analyzed. We know how you think, how you fight, how you react under pressure. On the main display, a formation of human ships moved through the Imperial fleet like sharks through a school of fish. Their movements were precise, economical, beautiful in their efficiency. Each attack was perfectly timed and positioned to maximize damage while minimizing exposure. You want to know the real difference between humanity and the other species you've conquered? Chen asked, leaning forward slightly. When you arrived at their world's end, demanded surrender, they asked themselves, how can we survive this? When you arrived at Earth and made the same demand, we asked ourselves, how can we kill them all? The Imperial formation was in complete disarray now. Ships fled in every direction, trying to escape an enemy that seemed to anticipate their every move. But the human vessels were everywhere at once, appearing and disappearing like ghosts, striking from impossible angles with weapons that turned the very laws of physics against their targets. Admiral, the tactical officer called out desperately, the Iron Dominion is requesting permission to retreat. Denied. Kethvar snarled. The Empire doesn't retreat from primitives. But, even as he spoke, he watched the Iron Dominion attempt to flee anyway, its captain's nerve finally breaking completely. The heavy cruiser turned away from the battle and began accelerating toward the edge of the system at maximum burn. It made it almost 3 kilometers before space itself seemed to twist around it, and the ship was suddenly flying backwards at the same speed it had been fleeing. Temporal reversion field, Chen explained helpfully. We're playing your ship's timeline in reverse. Don't worry, the effect is localized. Your crew is experiencing everything normally from their perspective. Kethvar watched his retreating cruiser slide backwards through space until it was exactly where it had been when it started to run. Then, the human ship maintaining the effect simply switched it off, leaving the Imperial vessel dead in space with its engines overloaded from the impossible stress of fighting causality itself. This is madness, Subcommander Ilix whispered. They're treating the fundamental forces of reality like tools. Not tools, Chen corrected, apparently having overheard the comment. Partners. Humanity spent our first 50,000 years learning to work with our environment instead of against it. When we reached the stars, we simply applied the same principle on a larger scale. The battle, if it could even be called that anymore, was clearly over. Of the 38 ships Kethvar had brought to intimidate a primitive world, only 12 remained operational. The rest had been destroyed, disabled, or transformed into object lessons in applied physics that would give his engineers nightmares for the rest of their lives. I'm offering you one final choice, Admiral, Chen said, her voice returning to the calm, professional tone she had used at the beginning of their conversation.
You can surrender your remaining vessels and allow us to escort you out of our system, or you can continue this demonstration and discover what other principles of reality we've learned to negotiate with." Cathvar looked around his bridge. His crew was staring at him with expressions ranging from shock to outright terror. The tactical display showed his remaining ships clustered together in a defensive formation that was obviously useless against an enemy that could simply ignore conventional physics whenever it became inconvenient. For the first time in his military career, Admiral Cathvar found himself considering surrender. "What guarantees do I have that you won't simply destroy us anyway?" he asked. "None," Chen replied honestly. "But, consider this, if we wanted you dead, Admiral, would we be having this conversation?" It was a fair point. The human fleet had demonstrated the ability to destroy Imperial vessels with casual ease. If their intent had been total annihilation, they could have accomplished it in the first few minutes of the engagement. "What are your terms?" Cathvar asked, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "Simple. You leave our system immediately and carry a message back to your empire. Tell them that Earth is not interested in joining their collection of subjugated worlds. Tell them that any future attempts at conquest will be met with the same response they've witnessed today." Chen paused, her expression hardening slightly. "And tell them that humanity remembers every species they've conquered. Every world they've subjugated. Every culture they've destroyed. We've been keeping a very detailed list." The implication hung in the air like a sword over Cathvar's head. This hadn't just been a defensive action. It had been a demonstration of capability coupled with a threat that extended far beyond Earth's solar system. "If we deliver this message," Cathvar said carefully, "what assurance do I have that your species won't use these weapons against the Empire offensively?" Chen's smile returned, and this time Cathvar recognized it for what it was. The expression of a predator that had just confirmed its prey was exactly as helpless as it had appeared. "Admiral," she said softly, "what makes you think we haven't already started?" The imperial capital of Nexus Prime had never seen a fleet return in such condition. Admiral Cathvar's remaining 12 ships limped into port like wounded animals seeking shelter, their hulls scarred with damage patterns that the Empire's best engineers couldn't explain. The Sovereign's wrath bore a perfectly straight line across its starboard hull where some incomprehensible human weapon had carved through 3 meters of Imperial battle armor as if it were paper. The line glowed with a soft blue light that refused to fade, no matter what anyone tried. Emperor Valden VIII, supreme ruler of 47 star systems and absolute master of 1,200 conquered species, stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows of his throne room and watched the damaged fleet dock with growing disbelief. In 3 centuries of imperial expansion, no fleet had ever returned from a conquest mission in such a state. "Explain," he said simply, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had brought worlds to their knees. Admiral Cathvar stood at attention in the center of the vast chamber, his usually immaculate uniform rumpled and stained. Behind him, the holographic display showed tactical recordings from the battle at Earth, footage that had been reviewed dozens of times by Imperial strategists who still couldn't accept what they were seeing. "Your Imperial Majesty," Cathvar began, his voice hoarse from hours of debriefing sessions, "the humans are not what they appear to be." "Evidently," Emperor Val then replied dryly. "Proceed." "Our initial scans detected a primitive civilization with early spaceflight capabilities. All intelligence indicated a routine conquest. They appeared to have basic nuclear technology, chemical propulsion, primitive orbital infrastructure. According to every metric we used to evaluate potential targets, they should have surrendered within minutes of our arrival." The Emperor turned from the window, his 8-foot frame imposing even without the ceremonial armor he wore for public appearances. "And yet you lost 26 ships to these primitives." "Yes, Your Majesty. They were prepared for us. They knew we were coming, they knew our tactics, they knew our technology. They had spent decades studying our expansion and developing countermeasures specifically designed to neutralize Imperial forces." "Countermeasures," the Emperor repeated slowly. "Show me." The holographic display activated, showing the moment when the human fleet had first opened fire. Emperor Valden watched in silence as Imperial shields simply failed to stop weapons that behaved like nothing in the Empire's extensive databases. He observed ships vanishing and reappearing at will, moving in patterns that violated basic laws of motion, wielding forces that treated reality itself as a malleable substance. Their technology is beyond our current understanding, Kethvar continued. They don't just use advanced science. They appear to have developed an entirely different relationship with the fundamental forces of the universe. They treat time, space, gravity, and entropy as tools to be manipulated rather than constants to be worked around. The Emperor gestured, and the display zoomed in on the moment when the Imperial cruiser Domination's edge had begun to disintegrate at the molecular level. Our scientists tell me this is impossible. Yes, Your Majesty. As was everything else they demonstrated. And their demands? Kethvar straightened slightly, knowing that this part of his report would be the most difficult to deliver. They have no demands, Your Majesty. They simply want to be left alone. Their Admiral Chan made it clear that any future attempts to conquer Earth would result in the same response we witnessed. Admiral Chan also mentioned that humanity has been keeping detailed records of our conquests, Kethvar continued reluctantly. She implied that they consider the Empire's treatment of other species to be unacceptable. Emperor Valvan was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications. Are you telling me that this primitive species is threatening the Empire? I believe they are, Your Majesty. And I believe they have the capability to follow through on that threat. The throne room's massive doors slid open, and Grand Admiral Thes-6 entered, his ceremonial robes billowing behind him. Thes-6 had overseen more conquests than any other Imperial officer, and his tactical genius was legendary throughout the Empire. Your Imperial Majesty, Thes-6 said, bowing deeply, I've completed my analysis of Admiral Kethvar's tactical recordings. And your assessment? Thes-6 straightened, his expression grim. The humans were not fighting defensively, Your Majesty. They were conducting a demonstration. Every attack was precisely calculated to disable or destroy while causing minimum collateral damage to their own forces. They could have annihilated Admiral Kethvar's entire fleet in the opening moments of the engagement. Emperor Valvan turned back to the window, studying the damaged ships in the distance. Then, why didn't they? Because they wanted survivors to carry a message back to us, Thes-6 replied. This was psychological warfare on a scale we've never encountered before. They wanted us to see their capabilities, to understand exactly what we would be facing if we chose to continue this conflict. Psychological warfare assumes that the target can be intimidated, the Emperor said slowly. The Galactic Empire does not yield to threats, regardless of their source. Your Majesty, Kethvar interjected carefully, with respect, I don't believe this was a threat in the traditional sense. It was a statement of fact. They weren't trying to frighten us into submission. They were simply informing us of the consequences of continued aggression. Emperor Valvan considered this. In 3 centuries of expansion, the Empire had encountered many defensive technologies, many desperate species fighting for their survival, many final stands by worlds that refused to accept Imperial rule. But they had never encountered anything like what Admiral Kethvar described. Grand Admiral, what is your recommendation? Thes-6 hesitated for the first time in his long career. Your Majesty, the traditional response would be to gather a larger fleet and return with overwhelming force. However, the humans appear to have accounted for that possibility. Their tactics suggest they can scale their response to match any level of force we bring against them. Furthermore, he continued reluctantly, their implied threat regarding our previous conquests suggests they may have capabilities that extend beyond their home system. If they have been monitoring our expansion for as long as they claim, they may have assets in place throughout Imperial space. The Emperor's expression darkened. You believe they have infiltrated our territory? I believe it's possible, Your Majesty. Their technology clearly allows for stealth capabilities far beyond anything we can detect. If they wanted to position forces throughout the Empire, we would have no way of knowing until they chose to reveal themselves. Emperor Valvan walked slowly across the throne room, his footsteps echoing in the vast chamber. The Empire had been built on the principle of overwhelming technological superiority. Every species they had encountered had eventually yielded to Imperial firepower and organizational efficiency. The idea that somewhere in the galaxy, a species existed that could not only resist Imperial conquest but potentially threaten Imperial holdings was almost inconceivable. Has there been any unusual activity in our other territories? He asked. Grand Admiral Thes-6 consulted his portable display.
Nothing overt, Your Majesty. However, there have been some minor anomalies in recent months that our analysts attributed to equipment malfunctions or natural phenomena. Specify. Communication disruptions in the Altair sector, unexplained sensor ghosts in the Centauri system, and several reports of ship sightings that couldn't be corroborated. At the time, these were considered isolated incidents of no strategic significance. Emperor Valden felt a chill that had nothing to do with the throne room's temperature. How many of our conquered worlds have reported similar anomalies? Thes 6 worked at his display for several minutes, correlating reports from across the Empire. When he looked up, his expression was troubled. Approximately 60% of our occupied systems have reported at least one unexplained incident in the past 6 months, Your Majesty. 60%, the Emperor repeated slowly. And we attributed this to coincidence? The incidents appeared unrelated, Your Majesty. There was no pattern our analysts could identify until now. Admiral Kethvar cleared his throat. Your Majesty, Admiral Chen mentioned that humanity has been studying our expansion for 50 years. If they have been positioning assets throughout Imperial space for that long, they would know more about our military capabilities than we know about theirs. They would know our patrol routes, our defensive positions, our supply lines, Grand Admiral Thes 6 added grimly. If they wanted to conduct a coordinated strike against Imperial holdings, they could cripple our entire infrastructure before we could respond, the Emperor finished. The three officers stood in silence for a moment, contemplating the implications of what they had discovered. The Galactic Empire, master of 47 star systems and conqueror of 1,200 worlds, might be completely at the mercy of a species they had dismissed as primitive only hours before. Your Imperial Majesty, Kethvar said finally, I believe Admiral Chen was offering us a choice. We can accept that Earth is not available for conquest and continue our expansion in other directions, or we can escalate this conflict and discover exactly how far human preparations extend. You're recommending that the Empire back down from a confrontation with a single world? Emperor Valden asked, his voice dangerously quiet. I'm recommending that we carefully consider the cost of that confrontation, Kethvar replied. Your Majesty, I watched them destroy Imperial vessels with weapons that shouldn't exist. I saw them manipulate space and time as if the fundamental laws of physics were merely suggestions. If they have been preparing for conflict with the Empire for 50 years, they may have capabilities we haven't even imagined yet, Grand Admiral Thes 6 concluded. Emperor Valden returned to his position by the window, staring out at the stars that represented his vast domain. Somewhere among those points of light, human agents might be waiting for his decision. Somewhere in the darkness between worlds, ships using impossible technology might be preparing to strike at the heart of everything he had built. Send a message to all sector commanders, he said finally. I want detailed reports on every anomalous incident in their territories for the past year. I want enhanced sensor sweeps of all major installations. And I want our intelligence services to begin immediate research into this humanity and their true capabilities. And our response to their ultimatum, Your Majesty? Grand Admiral Thes 6 asked. Emperor Valden was quiet for a long moment, weighing 3 centuries of imperial tradition against the stark reality of what his forces had encountered at Earth. The Empire will consider their message, he said finally. But we will also prepare for the possibility that consideration is not enough. As the 3 officers left the throne room, none of them noticed the small device that materialized briefly in the shadows near the Emperor's throne before vanishing again. Nor did they detect the brief transmission that carried their entire conversation to a monitoring station hidden in the asteroid belt of a system 3 sectors away. Admiral Sarah Chen reviewed the recording with satisfaction. The Empire was beginning to understand the situation, but they weren't quite ready to make the smart choice yet. That was fine. Humanity had waited 50 years for this moment. They could be patient a little longer. But not too much longer. 3 weeks after Admiral Kethvar's humbling return to Nexus Prime, the Galactic Empire mobilized the largest military force in its history. Emperor Valden stood in the Strategic Command Center deep within the Imperial Palace, surrounded by holographic displays showing the positions of over 2,000 warships. Every sector fleet had contributed vessels to the Armada, and the combined firepower represented the accumulated military might of 47 star systems. Status report, the Emperor commanded. Grand Admiral Thes 6 gestured to the central display. Operation Absolute Dominion is ready to commence, Your Majesty. Fleet Admiral Karath has taken command of the strike force.
We have 1,500 ships of the line, 300 support vessels, and 200 specialized craft including our most advanced stealth destroyers.
And our new weapons?
The research division has developed quantum disruption torpedoes specifically designed to counter the human's reality manipulation technology, Thes 6 replied. Additionally, we've deployed temporal anchor generators that should prevent their time manipulation abilities from affecting our ships.
Emperor Valvan nodded approvingly.
The Empire's response to the human threat had been swift and comprehensive. Every available resource had been devoted to developing countermeasures for the impossible weapons they had witnessed. If brute force wouldn't work against humanity, then the Empire would demonstrate its greatest strength, the ability to adapt and overcome any obstacle.
Intelligence reports, the Emperor asked.
Our deep cover operatives have confirmed increased activity in several border systems, replied Intelligence Director Zarth, his multiple eyes blinking in sequence.
However, we still cannot detect human ships directly.
Their stealth capabilities remain beyond our sensor capacity.
No matter, the Emperor said confidently.
They cannot hide from 2,000 ships conducting systematic sweeps of every cubic meter of space around their world.
The massive fleet began its journey toward Earth with a confidence born of overwhelming numerical superiority. Fleet Admiral Karath, chosen for his experience in difficult campaigns, commanded from the super dreadnought Imperial Destiny, a vessel 3 times larger than anything in Admiral Kethvar's original force.
What none of them knew was that humanity had been watching the fleet's mobilization since the day it began. Dr. Elena Vesquez, director of Earth's Strategic Intelligence Division, stood in the Situation Room buried beneath the Swiss Alps and watched real-time feeds from surveillance devices that had been silently observing Imperial activities for months. Every ship in the enemy fleet had been catalogued, its capabilities analyzed, its weaknesses identified. "They're bringing everything," she reported to Admiral Chen, who was reviewing tactical data on a separate display. "The entire Imperial Navy, plus experimental weapons and countermeasures specifically designed to neutralize our demonstrated capabilities."
"Expected," Chen replied calmly. "How long until they arrive?" 72 hours at their current speed.
"They're being cautious, running full sensor sweeps, probably expecting us to try to ambush them en route."
Chen smiled. "Let them come. Are our people in position?" "All insertion teams have been active for the past week. We have assets aboard every major vessel in their fleet, and our quantum observers are monitoring their command structure in real time." The beauty of humanity's preparation was its subtlety.
While the Empire had spent centuries developing bigger weapons and stronger armor, humanity had focused on infiltration, information gathering, and the kind of asymmetric warfare that had served them well throughout their evolutionary history. 50 years of careful observation had taught them that the Empire's greatest weakness was its own success. When you had conquered 1,200 species through overwhelming force, you began to assume that overwhelming force was the answer to every problem. When every enemy you had ever faced had eventually submitted to your firepower, you developed a dangerous blind spot regarding enemies who simply refused to fight on your terms.
"Admiral," Dr. Vasquez continued, "we're receiving reports from our monitoring stations throughout Imperial space.
They're moving defensive fleets to protect their core worlds, probably expecting us to launch a retaliatory strike while their main force is committed to attacking Earth."
"Logical but incorrect," Chen mused. "They're still thinking like an empire.
Territorial control, defensive positions, strategic resources.
They don't understand what they're really facing."
On Earth, the preparations for the Empire's arrival were proceeding with calm efficiency.
Unlike the previous encounter, this would not be a demonstration.
This would be education, and the lesson would be one the Empire would never forget. The Imperial fleet dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of Earth's solar system in perfect formation, 2,000 ships arranged in a battle sphere that could have reduced entire planets to rubble.
Fleet Admiral Karath reviewed the tactical displays with satisfaction.
No matter what tricks the humans had used against Admiral Kethvar, they could not possibly stand against this level of force.
"Begin sensor sweeps," he commanded. "I want every human ship located before we move into weapons range."
The fleet's sensors, enhanced with new detection algorithms specifically designed to penetrate human stealth technology, swept through the solar system with methodical precision. They found nothing. No ships, no energy signatures, no gravitational anomalies that might indicate cloaked vessels. "Sir," the tactical officer reported, "sensors are clear. No hostile contacts detected anywhere in the system." Fleet Admiral Karath frowned. According to Admiral Kethvar's report, the humans had deployed over 400 ships during the previous encounter. It seemed impossible that they could all be hiding so effectively. "Begin advancement to Earth," he ordered. "Maintain formation integrity. Deploy quantum disruptors to full range." The massive fleet began its approach toward the blue-green world that had humiliated the Empire 3 weeks earlier. As they closed the distance, more sophisticated sensors came online, scanning for any trace of the technology that had so thoroughly outmatched Imperial forces. They found evidence of humanity's presence everywhere except where it mattered. The space around Earth was filled with the electromagnetic signatures of an advanced technological civilization. Communications networks, navigation beacons, orbital industry, all the infrastructure of a spacefaring species. But no warships. No defensive installations. No indication that Earth was prepared to resist the largest military force in galactic history. "This doesn't make sense," Fleet Admiral Karath muttered. "Where are they?" His question was answered when Admiral Chen's image appeared on the main display of every ship in the Imperial fleet simultaneously. Not through Imperial communication systems, but by somehow taking direct control of their holographic projectors despite every security protocol the Empire had ever developed. "Fleet Admiral Karath," Chen said, and her tone was disturbingly cheerful, "welcome to Earth's solar system. I hope your journey was pleasant." "Human," Karath replied, his voice carrying the weight of 2,000 warships, "you will surrender immediately or face complete annihilation. The force I command could reduce your world to ash in minutes." "I'm sure it could," Chen agreed readily. "Those are very impressive ships you've brought. We've been studying the schematics for quite some time." Before Karath could process what that statement meant, every ship in his fleet suddenly found itself unable to move. Not disabled, not damaged, but simply locked in place as if space itself had become solid around them. Drive systems functioned perfectly, weapons remained online, life support continued uninterrupted, but the ships were frozen in the cosmos like insects in amber. "What have you done to my fleet?" Karath demanded. "Nothing permanent," Chen assured him. "We've simply adjusted the local spacetime curvature to create a stable equilibrium point around each of your vessels. Think of it as a gravitational parking space. Very energy efficient, completely reversible, and it gives us time to have a proper conversation." On the tactical displays throughout the Imperial fleet, proximity alarms began sounding as contacts appeared from nowhere. Not dozens or hundreds, but thousands of human vessels, materializing in perfect formations around each Imperial ship. They hadn't been hiding. They had been waiting in parallel dimensions, ready to slip sideways into normal space when needed. "Impossible," Karath whispered. "Parallel dimension manipulation requires energy levels that would destabilize local stellar mechanics. Only if you're trying to brute force your way through dimensional barriers," Chen explained patiently. "We prefer to ask the universe politely." It's amazing how cooperative reality becomes when you treat it as a partner rather than an obstacle to overcome. Fleet Admiral Karath stared at his tactical displays, watching 2,000 Imperial warships surrounded by twice that many human vessels that seemed to exist in the spaces between normal matter. His fleet's quantum disruptors, designed specifically to counter human reality manipulation, were registering no targets. His temporal anchor generators, built to prevent time manipulation, showed normal chronometer readings even as he watched human ships appear and disappear at will. "Your countermeasures are very clever," Chen continued, apparently reading his thoughts. "Unfortunately, they're based on your understanding of how our technology works, and your understanding is incomplete. You see quantum manipulation and assume we're forcing quantum states to change. You see temporal effects and assume we're manipulating time streams." One of the human vessels near Karatha's flagship did something that made every physicist on the bridge question their education. The ship simply stepped outside the normal three-dimensional framework of reality and rotated through what appeared to be a fourth spatial dimension before settling back into normal space facing the opposite direction. The truth is much simpler, Chen said. We learned to stop thinking of the universe as a set of laws to be obeyed and started thinking of it as a conversation to be had. When you ask nicely, and when you understand what you're really asking for, reality is surprisingly flexible. This is madness, Karath said, but his voice lacked conviction. Around him, his bridge crew was staring at sensor readings that described events that couldn't happen, watching their instruments document the impossible with calm precision. Is it madness, Chen asked, or is it simply a different way of thinking? Your empire has spent centuries perfecting the art of applying force until problems disappear. That's a valid approach, but it's not the only one. Admiral Chen gestured, and, suddenly, Fleet Admiral Karath found himself standing not on his own bridge, but in what appeared to be a vast library. Books stretched into the distance in every direction, their spines labeled with the names of star systems, species, and worlds. With growing horror, he recognized the names of every world the Empire had ever conquered. This is our archive, Chen explained, appearing beside him in the impossible space. Every species your empire has subjugated, every culture you've destroyed, every world you've stripped for resources. We've been documenting it all. Karath reached for one of the books at random. It bore the name of Kepler 442b, a world the Empire had conquered 2 centuries ago. Opening it revealed detailed records of the planet's indigenous civilization, their art, their literature, their scientific achievements, their final desperate resistance to imperial rule. They were poets, Chen said softly. The Keplerian civilization expressed mathematics through verse. They had developed theoretical frameworks for interstellar travel using nothing but metaphor and rhythm. Your empire destroyed them for their mineral resources. The empire brings order to chaos, Karath said automatically, the phrase drilled into every imperial officer since childhood. Does it? Chen asked. Or does it bring monotony to diversity? Look around you, Admiral. This library contains the records of 1,200 unique approaches to existence, 1,200 different ways of solving the problems of civilization. Your empire reduced all of that complexity to a single, simple pattern: submit or die. Karath found himself walking through the endless stacks, seeing the names of worlds he had personally overseen the conquest of. Each book was thick with the accumulated knowledge and culture of an entire species, reduced to historical curiosities by imperial efficiency. What do you want? He asked finally. We want you to leave, Chen replied simply. Not just Earth. All of it. Every conquered world, every subjugated species, every corner of space you've claimed through force. We want you to go home and think about whether the order you've created is worth the price you've forced others to pay for it. Suddenly, Karath was back on his bridge, surrounded by his confused crew and tactical displays showing impossible readings. The conversation in the library had lasted subjectively hours, but, according to his ship's chronometers, no time had passed at all. You're demanding that the Empire abandon 47 star systems? He asked. We're not demanding anything, Chen corrected. We're informing you of what's going to happen. The choice you get to make is whether it happens peacefully or whether we have to get creative about encouraging your withdrawal. Around the trapped Imperial fleet, the human vessels began to demonstrate exactly what getting creative might involve. Space itself seemed to become fluid around them, ships moving through impossible geometries, weapons that fired concepts rather than energy, defensive systems that worked by convincing attacks they had never been fired in the first place. This is your final warning, Fleet Admiral, Chen said, her image appearing once more on his display. The Empire ends today. How it ends is up to you. The end of the Galactic Empire began not with a battle, but with a choice that Fleet Admiral Karath made in the silence of his trapped flagship. Staring at the tactical display showing 2,000 Imperial warships surrounded by an impossible fleet of human vessels, watching his instruments describe technologies that redefined the very concept of possibility, Karath found himself thinking about his career. 40 years of service, 37 worlds conquered, hundreds of species brought under Imperial rule. He had always told himself it was for the greater good, that order was preferable to chaos, that unity under the Empire was better than the alternative. Now, surrounded by beings who had learned to ask the universe to rearrange itself on their behalf, those justifications felt hollow.
Open a channel to Admiral Chen, he said quietly. The human appeared on his display almost instantly, as if she had been waiting for his decision. Fleet Admiral. If we agree to your terms, Korath asked, what guarantee do we have that your species won't simply replace the Empire with your own version of conquest? Chen considered the question seriously. None, she said finally. You'll have to trust that a species that spent 50 years preparing for this moment instead of launching a surprise attack might have different motivations than pure conquest. And the conquered worlds? What happens to them? They get to decide for themselves. Some may choose to remain part of a reformed imperial structure. Others may seek independence. A few might even choose to maintain their current relationships with the Empire voluntarily. Chen paused. The difference is that it will be their choice, not yours. Fleet Admiral Korath looked around his bridge, seeing his own uncertainty reflected in the faces of his crew. These were good officers, loyal soldiers who had served the Empire with honor. They deserved to know what they were really fighting for. Patch me through to the entire fleet, he ordered. Every ship in the Armada received his transmission simultaneously. This is Fleet Admiral Korath. As Commanding Officer of Operation Absolute Dominion, I am hereby ordering the cessation of hostile operations against the human species. All ships will stand down and prepare to receive new orders. The silence that followed was profound. Across 2,000 ships, Imperial officers struggled to process an order that had no precedent in their military doctrine. The Empire didn't stand down. The Empire didn't retreat. The Empire conquered or died trying. Sir, his tactical officer said uncertainly, shouldn't we consult with Imperial Command before making such a decision? No, Korath replied firmly. This is my command, and these are my ships. I will not sacrifice 2 million Imperial personnel to preserve a system that conquers poets and destroys mathematicians who express themselves in verse. Admiral Chen nodded approvingly. A wise decision, Fleet Admiral. Your ships are free to leave whenever you're ready. As if to demonstrate the point, the spatial distortions holding the Imperial fleet in place simply vanished. The ships could move again, though none of their commanders seemed certain where they should go. However, Chen continued, before you depart, there's something else you should see. The main displays throughout the Imperial fleet shifted to show a real-time view of space around Nexus Prime, the Empire's capital world. What they saw there made even the impossible technologies they had witnessed around Earth pale in comparison. Nexus Prime was surrounded. Not by ships, but by structures that defied every architectural principle in the Empire's databases. Massive constructs that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously, their geometry shifting and flowing like living things. They had materialized around the capital without triggering a single alarm, without being detected by any sensor array, without causing so much as a ripple in the planet's defensive networks. How long have they been there? Korath whispered. Approximately 37 minutes, Chen replied. We thought it would be more efficient to have this conversation without the distraction of wondering whether your capital was secure. The implications hit Fleet Admiral Korath like a physical blow. While the Empire had mobilized every available ship to attack Earth, humanity had surrounded the most heavily defended world in Imperial space without anyone noticing. The defensive fleets that should have protected Nexus Prime were nowhere to be seen on the tactical display. Where are our defense forces? He demanded. Safely relocated to a parallel dimensional space while we conducted this operation, Chen explained. They're unharmed but temporarily unable to interfere. We'll return them to normal space once our business is concluded. Emperor Valthan's image suddenly appeared on the fleet's communication system, transmitted directly from his throne room. The supreme ruler of 47 star systems looked older than his years, his usual composure cracked by the sight of incomprehensible structures surrounding his world. Fleet Admiral Korath, the Emperor said, his voice strained, what is the status of your attack on the human homeworld? Korath straightened. Your Imperial Majesty, I have ordered the fleet to stand down. We are outmatched beyond any possibility of victory. Explain. They have capabilities that render our entire understanding of warfare obsolete, Your Majesty. They can manipulate space, time, and dimensional reality itself.
Our weapons are ineffective, our defenses are meaningless, and our numerical superiority is irrelevant against an enemy that can simply choose not to exist in the same reality where our attacks take place."
Emperor Valvan was silent for a long moment.
Around his throne room, Imperial advisors and military commanders stood in stunned silence, watching displays that showed humanity's impossible constructs hovering peacefully above their capital.
"What do they want?" the Emperor asked finally. Admiral Chen answered directly, her image appearing beside Karatha's on the Emperor's display.
"The end of the Empire as a conquering force, Your Imperial Majesty.
Complete withdrawal from all conquered territories.
Reparations to be paid to surviving populations of subjugated species. And a fundamental restructuring of your civilization's relationship with the rest of the galaxy."
"Impossible," the Emperor replied automatically.
"The Empire cannot simply abandon centuries of expansion."
"Of course it can," Chen said reasonably.
"The question is whether you choose to do so voluntarily or whether we need to demonstrate additional capabilities to help you reach that decision." As if summoned by her words, the structures around Nexus Prime began to change. They unfolded like flowers made of crystallized spacetime, revealing glimpses of technology that made the human fleet's previous demonstrations look simple by comparison. Reality itself seemed to bend around the constructs, creating visual effects that hurt to look at directly.
"What are those things?"
Emperor Valvan asked, his voice barely above a whisper.
"Possibility engines," Chen replied.
"Each one contains enough concentrated potential energy to rewrite the physical laws governing an entire star system. We could make your sun burn backwards, convince your planet that gravity works in reverse, or simply edit your entire civilization out of the universe's basic narrative structure."
"But we won't," she continued quickly, noting the expression of pure terror on the Emperor's face.
"Because unlike your empire, humanity doesn't believe in solving problems through destruction. We prefer creative solutions." The main display shifted to show something that would haunt Imperial nightmares for generations to come. Across the Empire's conquered territories, the same impossible structures were materializing above every occupied world. Hundreds of them, thousands, each one representing humanity's ability to reach anywhere in Imperial space and impose their will without warning or opposition.
"You see," Chen explained, "we've been very busy during the 50 years we've been preparing for your arrival. While your empire was focused on building bigger weapons and conquering more worlds, we were developing relationships with the species you had subjugated."
The display showed detailed recordings from dozens of worlds throughout Imperial space. On each one, local populations were emerging from hiding places humanity had helped them prepare, carrying weapons humanity had taught them to build, implementing plans humanity had spent decades helping them develop. "The Empire's greatest weakness," Chen continued, "has always been assuming that conquered populations would remain conquered. You never considered the possibility that someone might teach them to fight back effectively."
Emperor Valvan watched in growing horror as reports flooded in from across his domain.
On Altair 7, the conquered Altarians had somehow acquired weapons that could penetrate Imperial armor and were systematically dismantling the occupation force. On Beta Centauri, the subject population had vanished entirely, leaving behind only empty cities and confused Imperial administrators. On Kepler 442b, where the poetic mathematicians had been destroyed 2 centuries earlier, their descendants had returned from wherever humanity had hidden them and were reclaiming their world with technologies that made Imperial science look primitive.
"This is impossible," the Emperor said, though the words carried no conviction. "You cannot coordinate resistance movements across 47 star systems simultaneously." "We didn't coordinate them," Chen replied.
"We simply provided the tools and let each species determine their own path to freedom. Turns out, when you give enslaved populations the means to resist, they're quite creative about using those means."
Fleet Admiral Karath studied his tactical displays, watching as Imperial communications networks reported system after system falling into chaos.
Not military conquest, but popular uprising.
Not external invasion, but internal revolution.
The conquered species of the Empire were reclaiming their worlds with a coordination and efficiency that spoke of decades of preparation.
"How many?" he asked quietly.
"All of them," Chen replied simply. "Every conquered world, every subjected species, every population center under Imperial rule. We've been building this network of resistance for 50 years, ever since we first detected your expansion and realized what kind of empire we were dealing with. It took us about 30 years to make contact with representatives from all 1,200 conquered species, she continued. Another 15 years to develop the technologies and strategies they would need. The last 5 years were spent positioning resources and coordinating timing. Today was simply the day we chose to activate everything simultaneously. Emperor Valvan stared at the displays showing his empire dissolving in real time. 3 centuries of conquest, 47 star systems, 1,200 conquered worlds, all of it crumbling within hours as populations that had seemed permanently subjugated suddenly revealed themselves to be anything but helpless. You have a choice to make, Your Imperial Majesty, Chen said, her voice carrying a note of finality. You can order your remaining forces to attempt to crush these uprisings, in which case you'll discover exactly how far humanity's preparations extend and how creative we can be about supporting our allies. Or you can accept that the age of conquest is over and begin the process of building something better. And, if we choose the first option, the Emperor asked. Chen's smile was gentle but contained an edge that spoke of capabilities beyond imagination. Your Imperial Majesty, we've had 50 years to study your empire, your tactics, your psychology, your weaknesses. We know how you think, how you plan, how you respond to crises. We've been inside your communication networks, your command structures, your strategic databases for decades. If you choose to fight, you won't be fighting against the tools we've shown you today. You'll be fighting against tools we haven't even hinted at yet. The throne room of the Imperial Palace fell silent except for the soft humming of monitoring equipment documenting the dissolution of the greatest empire in galactic history. Emperor Valdan looked around at his advisors, his commanders, his ministers, seeing his own realization reflected in their faces. The Galactic Empire was over. What are your terms? He asked finally. Complete withdrawal of Imperial forces from all conquered territories within 1 standard year, Chen replied promptly. Reparations to be negotiated individually with each liberated species. Dismantling of the Empire's conquest-oriented military structure. And establishment of a new governmental framework focused on cooperation rather than domination. And, in return, humanity will provide technological and logistical assistance in transitioning your civilization to a peaceful economy. The species you formerly conquered will be encouraged to engage in fair trade relationships rather than seeking revenge. And you'll be given a place in the galactic community as equals rather than conquerors. Emperor Valvan considered the offer. It was more generous than he had any right to expect from a species with the power to simply erase his empire from existence. It was also the only alternative to watching his civilization tear itself apart as every conquered world rose in rebellion. I accept, he said quietly. Admiral Chen nodded. Then, welcome to the new galaxy, Your former Imperial Majesty. I think you'll find it a much more interesting place than the one you tried to conquer. As the impossible structures around Nexus Prime began to fade back into whatever dimensional space they had emerged from, and as Fleet Admiral Karatha's armada began its long journey back to Imperial space to oversee the greatest withdrawal in military history, and as 1,200 species across 47 star systems began the complex process of reclaiming their freedom, humanity settled back into the quiet work of building something better than an empire. After all, they had always been better at building than destroying. It was just that sometimes, you had to tear down the old structure before you could construct something new. And, in the archives hidden beneath the Swiss Alps, Dr. Elena Vesquez made a final entry in humanity's records, mission accomplished. The galaxy is free to grow again. Outside her window, the stars shone a little brighter, as if the universe itself approved of what humanity had accomplished. Perhaps it did. After all, when you learn to have conversations with reality itself, even the cosmos had opinions worth listening to.